Okay, I believe we now have managed to gather enough. This is like herding cats, isn't it? Trying to get TC members back from a break. Okay, so welcome back. So we're now back. We're now continuing our normal TC meeting in an open setting. I believe we're now being also. You can follow us on YouTube, and there's a broadcast. So and just to highlight the plans for this afternoon. So Richard and I would first provide a sort of brief overview of our discussions yesterday and today, and we would then hear from Pablo, Liane, and Harjit, so that we actually then have the opportunity to also have a dialogue with our non-party observers. Perhaps just to go through, give a brief overview. So we've discussed issues related to the fund, about the issue of the trustee, the board, guidance and accountability. I mean, there's some convergence on perhaps some of the more technical issues. It's very clear that these discussions will continue, and there's a divergence of views on a lot of the more political issues, obviously. So yesterday we spent half a day on the funding arrangements and half a day on the fund. Regarding the funding arrangements, you will have also seen the submissions that are available on the web, so you can also get a good idea of the issues that we've discussed. There's a broad range of funding arrangements that have been highlighted, and the work is really continues all this week, both on the fund and the funding arrangements. Then today we've turned to the issue of the scope. Again, quite lively discussions, I think, that have taken just about all of today, but also had a session on the sources. Richard, any more specifics you wish to highlight before we give the floor to our non-party observers?
Thank you, Uti, and welcome to the colleagues from civil society. It's good to have you finally in the room. I hope you're taking a picture of yourself so you can tell the world that we let you in. And thank you for constantly reminding us on the need to be open, inclusive, and transparent, and to listen to the voice of civil society. As I said yesterday, it's not falling on deaf ears. We just have rules that we need to follow. So thank you very much for your continued and consistent bothering of us and pestering us to do better, to respond better, and to finance better. So I think the discussions generally have been very positive. We have a lot of work to do to take the level of detail that we've been discussing into paragraphs that are succinct, clear, directional, and give guidance and mandates, and provide the fund with the legal capacities for it to do its work, and then the same on the funding arrangements. So we issued 3 notes this morning. I think they're going to be made public, right? I think they should be made public as long as no TC members object. That capture some of they're not summaries of our discussions, but they're the reflections of TC co-chairs on what we heard and where we see progress being made, or where there's still issues that are open. The mood is good. The TC knows that it's got limited time and we have a task ahead of us, and there's a very, very strong commitment to deliver on that and to make Hannah and our colleagues at the COP presidency happy and that there will be a successful outcome, but we still have a mountain to climb, and we look forward to the vigilance and the advice from civil society, as we always do. So I think that's all I'll say for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So then we don't actually know who's going to start. So, okay, so Leanna's going to start. So, Leanna, the floor is yours. And we're kind of hoping that you get to the same working modality like we are now shifting into sort of really sort of having targeted, focused comments and indeed providing us also your views on how to turn this into a success. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, relatively short notice, to come in already today. We were actually expecting, as was in the schedule, that we would have the session tomorrow, so not quite clear whether this is our only opportunity to engage or whether we still have the session tomorrow. And obviously, in the spirit of openness and inclusiveness, would plead for rather more engagement than limited engagement, which was also the tenor of the letter that we sent, when we learned that a substantial and maybe additional parts of this meeting might be in closed session. Also very much appreciate both from Yuti and Richard the short summary of the discussions, but also have to say, and I also want that in the context of what we can say here, that obviously does not substitute for not having been in the room for 1.5 days and being able to listen in detail to what is said, what was proposed, what is reacted to, and where there might be some emerging consensus and still continuing disagreement. So with not knowing actually how some of the discussions over the course of the last 1.5 days went, because we were not in the room, I will focus, and Harjeet will then follow after me. I will focus on some of our priorities and the vision for the fund that we continue to have, and that a number of us have elaborated in a technical submission for what we think should be important elements and should be included in a draft governing instrument for a loss and damage fund. And I think there is agreement that we absolutely need to get out here of the TC process with a draft governing instrument for the loss and damage fund. So maybe just to highlight a number of the points that are part of our continued vision for the loss and damage fund as elaborated by CAN International, Demand Climate Justice, and the Women and Gender constituency in our submission. That starts out that we obviously expect for the Loss and Damage Fund to be the anchor fund in the loss and damage finance landscape, to have a significant and ambitious contribution, particularly also to stand the test of time. And I think there is a lot of discussion about getting started really, really quickly, but I think we also need to balance the quick start with the ability of the fund to stand the test of time, be still fit for purpose, or with the ability to adjust 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road, because at least we fear, as long as it has taken us to get to this point, that we won't have another opportunity to design or get the political momentum into a loss and damage fund. Because of this, I think it's crucial for us that the fund addresses the shortcoming of the past around lack of access and bureaucratic processes, and that the fund must center communities' needs and ensure communities have easy access to the resources. Like in the Green Climate Fund, we expect for the Loss and Damage Fund, like the Green Climate Fund, we expect it to be a standalone fund with an independent secretariat and a board overseeing its operations. And that also means that when we think about the board, that we want the voices of those affected to be equitably represented in such a board. What we don't want to see is actually a shareholder type of continuation of board representation, and this would be, for example, one of the points of disagreement with the bridging proposal of the US, where both contributors, financial contributors, and a larger component of developed countries sits in the board. Who gets the money and from where? We expect, again, that the main financial inputs in the fund are from developed countries, to parties to the convention and the Paris Agreement. We want them to be exclusively in the form of grants and non-debt creating financial instrument. That is for us a matter of justice, as much as acknowledging that developing countries need the fiscal space to deal with losses and damages short and long term. It should obviously, as a fund, be capable of receiving and administering financial inputs on an ongoing basis. But that, I think, is possible for a standalone fund under the UNFCCC as much as a fund that is, for example, hosted by the World Bank. And on that proposal, and we heard rumors that that is a discussion about the fund being hosted by the World Bank, and there might be some support on that. We have some strong reservations and concerns in looking at the framework, the Financial Intermediary Fund Management Framework that the World Bank puts forward, what that means in terms of the need for the fund to comply with policies and procedures of the World Bank, what it might need for the ability to, again, be flexible and change the fund, what it might need in particularly for direct access and for enhanced direct access, which are the access modality that we want to see receive priority. And again, we are not setting up the adaptation fund, we are not setting up the JEF that were grandfathered in to the current fifth management framework, but I think this is a very different ballgame, and we need to be aware what some of the implications long terms would be. We have pointed out some of the funding channels that we would like to see. Again, I'm not repeating myself in the sense that we want to see obviously a comprehensive scope of the fund, particularly through 4 funding windows that we have pointed out: rapid onset, a window focused on medium term, on rebuilding lives, livelihoods, well-being and infrastructure through a rehabilitation and construction, a slow onset window, but also very crucially a community direct access window for subnational and local actors. Readiness and preparatory support is crucial. We know that from other funding contexts, the loss and damage fund is not different. For accessing, we need to tackle what has traditionally been impossible, namely for affected communities to really get easier access to it. And so I think there we need to be clear about national level coordination structures that can facilitate that community access. We want an inclusive and transparent fund, and that means that it's imperative that action supported by the fund must respect, promote, and consider human rights. And we demand a fund that, again, looks to be as effective and meaningful in public participation of affected communities, including women, youth, and indigenous peoples, as well as civil society organizations. And I probably forgot quite a bit that I wanted to say, including that we are still convinced that the best way going forward is for the fund to be an operating entity of the financial mechanism. And I would pass it over to Harjeet to talk about some of our thinking and points on funding arrangements.
Thank you, Lian. So I'm Harjeet Singh from Climate Action Network International. Thank you to the TC members and particularly co-chairs Uti and Richard for the opportunity, and thank you, Uti, for saying that this is normal when civil society is in the room. So just building on what Lian said, on the joint work that we did on governing instrument, which another piece of work that we have started working on as Climate Action Network International, global campaign to demand climate justice and women and gender constituency on the criteria for assessing finance to address loss and damage. And this is particularly applicable in case of funding arrangements. And we all know that the distinct purpose of loss and damage finance and how we need to make sure that the finance that we count does not detract from or get double counted or as official development assistance, humanitarian assistance, or climate adaptation and mitigation. And that's exactly the reason we all have been advocating to focus loss and damage finance for addressing part and not averting and minimizing, so that we are very clear about the purpose of loss and damage finance. And so which means that we need to have a very clear definition and the way we assess what constitutes funding to address loss and damage finance. Currently, there's a lack of clarity to discern what government contributions should be counted, and that's why we need to all agree in a set of criteria so that we are very clear in terms of the money that's now going to be put forward or the existing flow as part of funding arrangement, whether it should be counted as loss and damage finance or not. So to that end, we are putting forward 6 key criteria to be used in assessing. And let me read that out for you. I'll go a bit deep into some of those, but not all, so that we can have it more as part of interaction. The number 1 is recognize and aim to comprehensively address loss and damage, which Liana also briefly alluded to. Second, be obligatory and compensatory, with funding provided as grants and non-debt creating instruments. Third, be new, additional, predictable, and adequate. Fourth criteria, be equitably governed and provided. Fifth, ensure the meaningful and effective participation of affected communities. And sixth, acknowledge, respect, and promote intersectional human rights. I can briefly touch upon, for instance, when we talk about the first one, recognize and aim to comprehensively address loss and damage, the onus rests on the contributors to explain and ensure how the stream that's now going to be seen as part of the funding arrangement is comprehensive. For instance, when we look at some of the discussions that are happening and the institutions that are being considered, some clearly fall into that category. For example, Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, the work that's going to happen, the focus remains on loss and damage, whereas the work being done by several institutions and processes such as Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery or Global Risk Financing Facility do not specifically mention loss and damage in their material. And we need to develop set of indicators, and some of the indicators that we have identified like a recognition of the limits of adaptation, focus on reconstruction, restoration, and rehabilitation, financial support for communities, including who are displaced by climate-related disasters, even with temporary or permanent relocation support needs, and overall the focus being on loss development, recovering the loss development, both economic and non-economic. The second one on being obligatory and compensatory, again, we have emphasized on the grants and non-debt creating instruments. Needless to say, loss and damage is a fundamental issue of justice, and countries who have done least to contribute to the climate crisis are now suffering. And many of these impacts are irreversible in terms of loss of biodiversity, culture, heritage, and territory. So it has to be seen from the perspective of being compensatory and obligatory and not in the form of aid or charity. Again, we have talked about specific parts such as full cost grants and no accessibility restrictions based on recipient developing country income or aid eligibility classifications. And the funding streams must avoid using words such as aid, charity, or assistance because they have to be obligatory in nature. Similarly, we have also detailed on new, additional, predictable, and adequate. We must recognize that when we talk about it being more predictable, it allows countries to plan for its use, and adequate to meet the current and future needs, and funding that does not create debt. Again, Liana has talked about the equitable governance, so I will not repeat that part. But I must highlight the transparency at the governance level, meaningful participation of communities who are adversely impacted, and particularly women, indigenous people, persons with disabilities, and youth. Yeah, so we have talked about the participation, and I must also highlight the sixth criteria, which is about respecting and promoting intersectional human rights. So all these funding streams must very specifically acknowledged the need to respect and promote human rights in its core policies and guidance. Similarly, ability to obtain the free, prior and informed consent of indigenous people and local communities as an iterative process, and some of the accountability mechanisms to communities. So these are some of the criteria, the indicator that we have started working on. It's a work in progress, and we will be sharing further analysis of different funds so that we have a collective understanding of what can or cannot be counted as part of loss and damage funding arrangements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Harjeet and Liana. Then turning to Pablo. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair Katukia, and I'm quite sorry to say as well that it's a bit difficult to really provide a solution-oriented input when we had not been present in the room. I just apologize if my intervention is a bit off topic, but I want to say that pursuant to budget and legislative and executive actions, local governments are still publicly accountable in decisions. So we not only implement local and climate actions, but we are prepared to respond, and the first ones prepared to respond to losses and damages associated with climate change. I just wanted to bring some key messages that we think could be taken into account when designing the funding mechanism and the respondent will have. We believe that a sustainable development goals and the Paris Agreement are interconnected. The response that this fund must provide should be a territorial approach that is multi-scalar and multi-level to address the loss and damage cascading effects. Loss and damage has been, on the one hand, responded by local and regional governments through action plans, but could be addressed by a specific loss and damage action plans and programs that could be addressed as part of the funding of this mechanism. I think equity must be brought at the heart of the mechanism in this definition of development, and it should be a truly inclusive multilateral board that must be built to govern the fund, acknowledging all constituencies that are here now present. We local and regional governments, as custodians of the local commons, we believe that we can provide a series of services, climate services led by local and regional governments that could help the implementation of the fund. For example, structural dialogue with local communities, data collection to ensure that there's a threshold met where this local data can provide an avenue so that the fund reaches those who need it the most, and really be the providers of services that in a time of crisis could help ensure a just transition between the addressing of loss and damage and climate-related services. We call on looking at decentralized cooperation as an example of what we achieved in the past. And yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Do any of the TC members around the table wish to raise any issues or questions with our non-party observers at this point? I mean, obviously, they'll now be here with us for the rest of the meeting, so there'll be plenty of opportunities also for very informal interaction during coffee breaks and lunches. Avinash, please.
I wondered if I could ask Harjeet if he could tell us a little bit more about his criteria for the funding arrangements.
So we have a fear that there are several funding streams that are currently operating outside UNFCCC may be counted as part of funding arrangements, while they may not actually be responding to the needs of communities in a comprehensive manner. And to avoid that, what we need to do collectively is to develop a set of criteria to say which really conform to those criteria to be counted as loss and damage finance. Because the needs are much greater, and we cannot just start double counting the money that's there and which is not helping communities recover adequately. So 6 criteria that we have put forth can help assess. There are some which may fully conform to those criteria, some may not, and some may be on the spectrum. And I think that understanding needs to be there than just simply saying, just because they have, they are partly responding to some of those needs, we can now start counting them as loss and damage finance. So that's what we are trying to do to put forth some thinking around it.
Uti, I think that's a really interesting point, because I think in some of our discussions, some people have assumed that there's lots of different funding, that there's a lot of climate funding, and I think Harjeet is saying that a lot of this funding does have its very specific conditionality around it, of which loss and damage may not be the core aspect.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why to have a set of criteria to assess that, so that we all have a same yardstick, so that we don't really just start counting anything or everything under loss and damage finance is important.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, please.
Thank you very much. Well, my first thanks go to the co-chairs for recalling the need for us to have much to celebrate at COP28. And of course, thank you all, Pablo, Lian, and Harjeet, for stressing the need for strong, clear recommendations from the TC in fulfilling the mandate set forward in Sharm. It's been a pleasure to speak with you on the sidelines, and we are very happy to have you with us in the room as well. A couple of questions that I think we've spent some time on today that I didn't hear much on in the initial interventions, but would be keen to hear your views on, are specifically on innovative sources of finance. As well as on the concept of prearranged finance and what your thoughts are on that. It would be very interesting to hear from all of you, if possible, but and also understanding that through you represent a large number of constituencies that may be following us online as well. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to start? Liana? Yeah.
I would maybe start on the innovative sources, and Harjeet, I think you are the better person to talk maybe on the prearranged finance. Again, we have had no time to coordinate or so it's basically just from some of our engagement and understanding. So obviously, and I think that was part of the intervention that I gave, we consider the public contribution of developed countries, grant inputs, to be the main source of financing, but not the exclusive source of financing. And I think this is reflected in an understanding of a governing instrument for the loss and damage fund that leaves the possibility for, whether you call them alternative or innovative sources of finance, to be considered. And so I think they do have a space for a board of a loss and damage fund, then to also determine what are some of the most applicable sources of innovative finance that again should also be complying with some of the considerations of equity, of fairness. And so obviously that applies to, and again, I'm not an expert on a lot of that, but that also applies obviously in the way you look at, for example, the suitability of different taxes and levies, or the suitability, of funding sources, like in the context of the adaptation fund, where you basically draw some funding through the market mechanism. And I'm not saying necessarily that would be one of the innovative sources, but this is obviously something that has been considered as a possibility. But again, I think the again bigger question then is, and that goes back to the issue of the criteria, to actually also think about, again, what can we account for loss and damage finance, particularly to addressing loss and damage, and how can we then track what is either considered or labeled or claimed as loss and damage finance. So I would probably leave it there.
Thanks. Yep. Harshit?
Yeah, I can talk briefly about pre-arranged finance. So when we talk about the concept of pre-arranged finance, of course, it makes a lot of sense, and this has evolved after, years of our experience of responding to emergencies when it takes time to receive money, and especially in the context of the immediate response and recovery needs. So pre-arranged finance is a system which is about allocating money in advance, earmarking that fund, and making it readily accessible, which can very well be part of the loss and damage system. But what will be needed is how we are using that system to provide more money, which is going to help communities recover. As part of pre-arranged finance, we normally look at contingency funds. We talk about grants that are made available in advance and insurance. Now, if we are able to provide contingency fund to communities and countries who we know are already vulnerable, I think it's a great idea. It can be very well seen as part of the loss and damage financing system, but of course they will need a lot more money than what we are providing right now. Similarly, grants can be pre-allocated for countries knowing that they are going to be facing storms or floods in a particular season. Now, coming to insurance, we all know that we have spent, and in my previous interventions as well, I highlighted as humanitarian system and also as part of our loss and damage conversation, we have spent disproportionate amount of time on insurance. And recent examples of how it is failing even in the developed world, we need to take cognizance of that it's a tiny part of the overall response that we have when it comes to insurance. It doesn't work for slow onset events. So while it is seen as part of pre-arranged finance, but it's not really working in many cases when it comes to even the extreme weather events. So I think we should definitely recognize it as a system, but as I said, we need to be putting in a lot more money and strengthen that so that that system then works for increasing intensity and frequency of disasters, and even in some cases for slow onset events.
Thanks. Then next I have Heike, followed by Christina. Heike, please.
Thank you very much, Uti, co-chair. Thank you, representatives of civil society and youth. Great to have you here. Thank you for allowing us the space also to have, I think, very useful discussions and frank discussions in the TC. I have basically two questions. One is on how you look at nationally owned plans for risk management for loss and damage. I know that speaking for civil society, local communities and direct access are key. How do you see the value of these nationally owned processes to manage risk and prepare? And that would be one question. And the second one, reflecting on, again, already 2 days of frank discussions and really joint search for better answers, for common ground for our mandate. And having you in our room virtually or in person for many months already, with all the documents on the table, interacting with us, listening to also the exchange in the room, I would be interested what, until this point of time, your lessons learned are, where you are reflecting maybe differently on some positions that you brought to the table at the first time. After now 2 meetings, and we are well in the third, 2 workshops, Glasgow Dialogue, and all those documents. So if you would share, because this is what we are doing here, and I can only applaud all colleagues that we have frank discussions and really try to find common ground and also reflect on our positions. Thank you.
Yeah, why don't we sort of keep it interactive? So do you want to answer, and then we go to Christina? I think it's seems nicer that way, doesn't it? Rather than.
I can start, and yes, it's always useful to have such an interactive session. Thank you for this question, Heike. And in terms of what we need at the national level, absolutely. As we are developing this system at the international level, unless we have a strong and robust system and processes at the local and national level, we will not be able to support communities. That's our ultimate goal. It's not about to win an institution or our inputs inside the system, but eventually helping people recover. And for that, we also need to understand that developing countries are on a journey. It's only recently there is now awareness how we need to look at the whole system in a much more comprehensive manner, where we bring and build on our efforts that we have made so far on disaster risk management. Again, coming from the humanitarian and risk reduction experience, I know that many island nations in particular already had brought their disaster risk reduction, humanitarian and climate change system together for a very long time. Also because many of the disasters that they face are climate related. So it happened quite organically. Whereas I can take the case of India, not because I'm from India, but it was remarkable to see that Environment Ministry now has given the responsibility to NDMA, and I know there's a colleague here from NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority, which is actually quite a very useful thing because that's their day job. So National Disaster Management Authority has been dealing with disasters for a very long time. That's what they do, although their focus has been on extreme weather events and of course non-climatic disasters, but not slow onset events. So for them, now it's going to be a steep learning curve to make sure that they cover the whole spectrum of climate disasters, but at least it's now in the right hands. So which means that their capacity needs to be boosted. And what is most important, and as civil society we always emphasize upon, is the role of local communities. We know that they are the first responders, and unless their capacity is boosted, we will not be able to see that effective and efficient response. And that's why we also, in our proposal that Liana was talking about, the joint proposal, we have talked about direct access for communities, so that they are able to access these resources directly. On your second point, in terms of lessons learned and where we are right now, it's a mixed feeling, and also positive when I say mixed. Where we are at this moment, and in fact right from the very first TC meeting, I would say, and having been in negotiations for 15 years, I found the very first meeting organized in Egypt very, very constructive, with a lot of positive tone and a granular discussion. So thanks to all the TC members, and particularly the government of Egypt, the way they started with a very informal way of bringing everybody together and relationship, and then getting into the hardcore conversations, yet the tone was very constructive, which we really liked. And of course we were also given the opportunity to engage and interact. But where we are quite anxious at this moment, that we have not been, while we have taken a lot of inputs in the last two TC meetings and workshops, but we don't see many options where we have narrowed down on, and I see countries and blocks are stuck to their old positions. There are some baby steps, but we still have a long, long way to go on the fundamental issues. So, and we really hope that in the next 2 days we see some progress, and eventually at TC4 we have a set of recommendations for the COP.
Okay, then turning to Christina.
Thank you, Uti. And thank you, Leanne, Harjit, and Pablo for the initial intervention and also this exchange. A couple things. One, Leanne, you had mentioned in your intervention a point about the U.S. bridging proposal and the board composition, and you had said you were, I don't know what your word was, but that you were surprised about there being more developed countries, and from our math, it is equal. We added additional seats for contributors but we're not making assumptions of where those contributors are coming from. So in our view, it is, at least for the party seats, it is balanced. So if you're feeling like it's not, I don't know, our math works out that it is. I would be really keen to hear more from you on if you can say more about how you would view inclusive representation on the board. We tried, I mean, this is to Harjeet, your point about you're not seeing parties or, sorry, members moving, and our hope was that submission on a bridging proposal, which reflects both our attempt to bridge and reflect what we've heard, but also tries to put down our U.S. positions on some issues. Not all of them, because some of them we understood if this is a bridging proposal that, for example, on sources of funding, that there's a placeholder. But we were trying to reflect what we heard from you about looking at other models of boards with representation that go beyond party representation. So I do hope that you see us, because I get the sense that we are trying to move forward. I'd love to hear more about sort of how you see it. We put one representative from civil society, one from philanthropic world, one from private sector, and one from indigenous peoples. We have gotten some feedback on that about concerns about selection. Our thought was it could be a self-selection process, but really keen to hear from you all on that. Just another sort of reflection on progress. As you all, as the three of you I hope know, especially since you're referencing Luxor, Harjeet, in Luxor, we had been, continue to have strong views on the importance of the fund being dedicated and specialized towards slow onset events. And what we're trying to reflect in this bridging proposal is that in response to that, since Luxor, we've gotten a lot of feedback and heard a lot of input that is not sufficient. So we were trying to reflect what we had heard, while also in the governing instrument text, laying out what the structure and modalities would be to get a bit clearer on how it would work. So I just wanted to ask a few of those questions and also reflect on the point that Harjeet made about moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. And I'm hopefully I'm remembering the board composition right. So it was basically 10 Western European and other representatives, 1 Eastern Europe, and 4 contributors. No, that was not, and 4 contributors depending on quote unquote who contributes the most. And the sense that we got, or how it reflects for us, is again that this is, it's not an equitable representation in the sense that you are reflecting, as for example the adaptation fund does, the reality of the majority of the countries being developing countries, and also the countries that are the most affected and the worst affected by climate change and loss and damage, especially, so that a fund that is to provide for them should have that equitable representation on the countryside. But it seems to reflect very much an MDB mindset of a shareholder governance model and distribution, and I don't think we see that for a fund where we believe there is an obligation because of historical responsibility for developed countries to really contribute public funding. In terms of the reflection of having a board seat for non-party members, which is something that is welcome, and I on a personal level, I'm not basically right now coordinating with everybody else in civil society, appreciate, and I think this reflects a broader civil society input that we would really like to see, voice and vote of affected communities, or for example indigenous people on the board, so that is acknowledged that one has looked at again some of the other models. I think my ideal board or our ideal board suggestion would be an equitable country representation plus some of the community representation on the board, and I agree that probably would have to be through a self-selection process rather than a determination process. Sorry, did I miss the second question? I think that was on the board composition specifically. I think I missed the second one. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
If I can add. So on the question around contributors and they being given extra seats, from our perspective, it's a principal issue, it's a moral issue. We do not even have a second thought that who the primary contributors are. For us, it's rich and developed countries. We are not saying we are closing the doors on the voluntary contributions. Anybody should be able to contribute, and the conversation should go beyond what we have achieved in the Green Climate Fund. But at the same time, primary responsibilities of contributors. So if we are saying developed countries are contributing and they are the biggest contributors, they occupy those 4 seats. We are not expecting developing countries suddenly to become contributors, and that's why they are also contenders of that. So from that perspective, it gets lopsided if we are offering those seats to contributors, and we cannot move away from the historical responsibility. And as we need to recognize the reason we are facing loss and damage is because of actions and inactions over the last 30 years. We cannot deny that fact. And if we consider historical responsibility, it's the rich countries. So that's why in our criteria, we also talked about the spirit of compensatory and obligatory nature of finance. And some of the areas where, when I said that we have still not bridged some of the proposals or narrowed down options, for instance, for us, and again, I'm repeating, money has to be in the form of grant and non-debt creating instruments. And we see that in the bridging proposal, there are all kinds of options. And if you're saying private finance, in what form that private finance is going to be used, and especially when we talk about recovering lost development, how can private financing really help that? In what form eventually? Similarly, the question on direct access or your point around rapid onset. There's a report by Oxfam which says nearly just half of the humanitarian appeals are funded, and humanitarian appeals don't even consider full cost of loss and damage. So we cannot rule out funding for recovery from rapid onset disasters and focus loss and damage fund only on slow onset. Now, there's a huge gap of funding when it comes to recovering from extreme weather events. So those are some of the key questions, and Liana has already covered around our position on having an operating entity and not relying on MDBs, knowing that their business model has not really helped developing countries and rather caused more issues there than really helping them.
Okay, so we'll still have 2 interventions from the TC members. So first we'll have Dan and then Debbie, and then we'll get some final remarks from Liana, Harjit, and Pablo, and then we'll close for the day. So Dan, please.
Thank you, Leanne, Pablo, and Harjit, for all your points and inputs and attention to this process. I think it's very clear to me the importance of civil society's role in many dimensions of the loss and damage work, the work towards this decision and its outcomes, and also specifically in relation to the direct support of communities experiencing loss and damage. And I think many proposals from various actors inside and outside of the TC have really recognized this with inclusion of direct access windows for civil society and had been mentioned by yourselves. And I was interested to hear a bit about how you would see this community and civil society direct access window working. Obviously, in some cases, we wouldn't expect the community to be directly applying to a multilateral fund, So are there specific intermediaries that you feel would be identified, or would this be an open call for civil society to partner with communities to develop proposals? I guess the reason I'm trying to understand that is obviously in some cases, there'll be different government attention to civil societies, which will differ very much by context. In some ways, the government could be a way of bringing down funds, and there could be some expectation that within a sort of program there would be involvement of civil society, but obviously not in all cases could you expect that to be the case. So it seems that becomes part of the rationale for there to be a specific window. But I'd just like to understand in practice and more detail what you see that window sort of doing and how it would be accessed. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And this is an important question, as it is one of the core priorities that we see. I don't think there needs to be necessarily one single modality, even under the community access window. As you said, and I think we've laid that out in some of the documentations that we have submitted, there is obviously the opportunity to consider or rely on some of the existing mechanisms, like, for example, existing some of the few existing small grant setups. There is also the possibility, and I think our understanding was that a small grant window would provide funding comprehensively, again, across the spectrum, to think of some of the direct cash transfer options. So through some of the budget support, for example, there could be some understanding of certain amounts of cash transfer that goes directly then to community from money that goes to recipient countries. We could also foresee, for example, that that through the fund, working with some partners, some of those that there is some setup for devolved financing, in the sense that you have community coordinating mechanism in recipient countries that would then provide the distribution of small grants through basically enhanced direct access situation. And again, I think it would be very important to also work with a number of civil societies and existing small grant funders already in recipient countries. So, for example, there are many small grant fund providers like environmental funds and women's funds that can help specifically. And obviously, and I mean, I think this is something that is an option at the moment, but unfortunately, when we look, for example, at the experience of the Green Climate Fund, not enough. I think it's also both an opportunity and an obligation for both international and national entities that do access funding to think more creatively how they can ensure that funding actually is provided in those small tranches, which is what is needed for most communities to actually have actions that respond to their needs and priorities. And those are often very small amounts in an unbureaucratic way, meaning by taking on some of the documentation and reporting burden to pass that on. Thanks.
If I can very briefly complement, I mean, we do recognize different contexts and political situations, and I must also use the opportunity to clarify that even as civil society, our position is that majority of funds must be channeled through governments as part of direct access. So even when we say, communities need to have access, that's not to undermine or take away money that should be going through governments, because they do play the biggest role and the important role in terms of recovery, and especially the programmatic funding. And there are situations such as fragile country context, that's where enhanced direct access becomes really important, and even in case of finding innovative solutions. And if I can also use the opportunity, we heard in the gallery and during lunch and tea time that there was a conversation about having a civil society member as part of the board. It's not a written position right now, but the discussion that we are having as civil society, we should not be a voting member, and I can say that upfront for that, because I know there was some conversation. I don't think civil society should be having that capacity to vote, because that brings a conflict of interest. We would like the opportunity to independently assess, provide our inputs, engage, but not vote in favor or against a particular proposal. So that's the conversation we are having.
Okay, thank you. And then the last word goes to Debbie from the TC.
Thanks very much, Uti. Leanne, when you started, you talked about the fund being an anchor fund in this space. When you began, Harjeet, you talked about, you gave us 6 criteria around the funding arrangements, which I think is an interesting sort of ordering framework. I wondered if you've done much thinking about how the fund and the funding arrangements should interact, and whether you have any specific proposals for us on that. Thank you.
I can start off. Those are all very hard questions, very late in the afternoon, but we are doing our best. When we are talking about an anchor fund, I think we are talking about it both in terms of scale, scope, and importance. So obviously, scale is that it's the major multilateral climate fund that is providing funding for addressing loss and damage. In terms of scope, again, that is comprehensively covering the broad spectrum of activities on loss and damage, because I think it's also very important, maybe, and that's why I said initially, I think it's important to think of a fund that stands the test of time. 10 years from now, our knowledge on various areas of loss and damage will be very differently right now. If we would set up the Green Climate Fund now and not have set it up in 2011, we probably would do things very differently. So this is not, we are not in a static time frame, but we need, and that would be the idea of an anchor that also not only in scale, as scope and important is looked to as kind of the signal giver within the broader architecture of actors and funders and agencies that do and will continue to do varying bits of pieces of addressing loss and damage, right? The humanitarian actors, the others, all of which are not necessarily under the principles of the UNFCCC, all of which the mosaic pieces have important contributions to make, but to ensure those mosaic pieces actually form a coherent picture, including in terms of accountability and transparency of what can be founded and what can be recorded as funding to address loss and damage. And that goes back to the criteria point that Harjeet is articulating. We need basically the one kind of, central force, right? That brings the discourses together, which is also why we are thinking in terms of the complementarity and coherence, that the fund really is supposed to have a core role in providing through convening, through the interaction, through maybe setting some standards, to helping, guiding in definition, in setting definitions and so on and so forth, some guidance on the way forward on what funding for addressing for loss and damage is. Maybe leave it there, and Harjeet, if you want to come in.
Yeah, let me add more from a very principle level. So the reason we say that loss and damage fund has to be the anchor fund and should have a mechanism to coordinate with other funding streams as part of funding arrangement. There's a UN report, I remember, came out in March 2015, which said 90% of disasters are climate related. That's the UN report, just before Sendai framework was going to be agreed. I'm talking about 8 years ago. I'm sure it's a lot more than 90% now. And when 90% of disasters are weather-related, climate change has a handprint on almost all of them. We know that, and now the attribution science has evolved. So which body should be responsible and accountable to respond to those disasters? Clearly UNFCCC. And we are not saying that everything must happen through that body, but should the accountability lies with UNFCCC, very clearly, because increased number of disasters is a failure of climate action. And then it should create mechanisms to coordinate with other processes that have evolved over time to make sure that the support is made available to communities who are facing these disasters. So the accountability also at a very principal moral level rests with UNFCCC. So, and some of the conversations that we have had on funding arrangements somewhere are acting as distraction. If we start with that premise that UNFCCC has to take that primary role and then talk about what exists and what doesn't exist and how it can play the anchor role, I think things will start falling in place.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for this late afternoon lively exchange. So this now then concludes our second. Today's what? The second day of the second meeting day. Okay, so 2 down, 2 to go. We reconvene tomorrow at 9. Yang-Chi. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Thank you, Udi. Just on behalf of our groups, I would like to make 2 quick points to today's session. So I will finish in less than 30 seconds. Thank you, everyone. So I really appreciate that all the colleagues today, the views, valuable views to today's session. So the first one, I would like to say we have a big concerns to using the tax and levy as sources for the loss damage fund. It is essential to remember that tax treaty negotiations and the related matters fall under the mandate of ANGA. These negotiations are tied to broader international economic considerations, making them outside the scope of UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement. Secondly, the term in position to do so is not established as grid language and UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement. Introducing language that lacks consensus might lead to misunderstandings and hinder effective collaboration. I will stop here. I will not go into the details, just on behalf of our groups. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the meeting is closed. We reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I was also asked to read an announcement. So a representative of our host government would like to speak to all TC members after this meeting, so that means now, if they could kindly stay behind for just a few minutes. Thank you.
So I just want to also remind colleagues that we circulated documents this morning and we had asked you for comments, and please can you provide them to us again. I don't want thousands of edits, just check we're going in the right direction, and developing countries put in your stuff so we can balance it, please. Thank you.
Okay, and one final announcement. Apparently, the Secretariat reminds me, apparently it wasn't clear that tomorrow's meeting is open, so tomorrow's meeting is open at 9 o'clock.